Fáilte go club leabhar Eilís Dillon, mar chuid de léamh mór na Gaillimhe. You're all very welcome to the Eilís Dillon Book Club Week 2 as part of Galway's Great Read. And if you've just joined us, I think the faces I'm seeing there, I think you were with us last week. But for any newcomers just joining us, we are exploring the life and work of Eilís Dillon in her centenary year. And we're doing it through the lens of her first historical novel, The Bitter Glass, which was published in 1958. Now, last week we eased our way gently into the book and we looked at the first 3 chapters, and we were looking at the world that Dillon is creating in those early chapters. And we also discussed her early life in Galway. She was born, of course, she lived the first 3 years of her life in Dangan House and then moved to Barna, where she went to national school. And it was a great pleasure to hear about her life and work from her son, Cormac, and her daughter, Emily Cullen. So this evening we're going to make a few deeper incursions into the book, and we're going to talk about the historical themes and the cultural themes running through the book, and the author's deep interest in the oral tradition in Connemara. And indeed, she celebrates this oral tradition in many of her novels by including ballads and songs in the text, and by talking about, the keen and the American wakes and all of those things. So we'll also discuss The Bitter Glass in terms of Dillon's corpus of historical fiction. It was the first of her 6 historical novels, and we'll be talking to an expert on Eilís Dillon, Dr. Annemarie Herron, who wrote her PhD on the author. And she'll be joining us later, I'm delighted to say. So just a few housekeeping guidelines again to start with. Just for anyone who missed it last week, I would ask you to please switch on your video and keep it on for the duration of the session, because to encourage a sense of community and the feeling of a book group, a book club. But I'd also ask you to please mute your mics until we're speaking, just to kind of cancel out any background noise that may be heard in the background. And just to reiterate again, this is not a specialist group of experts. This is for everyone and anybody who has an interest in Eilís Dillon and her work, or learning more about her. And everyone's opinion counts, and we all experience books in our own unique way. So I'm looking forward to continuing our discussions this evening. And to any new faces joining, you're very welcome. And actually, if we do have newcomers this week, could I ask you to please just say your name there and where you're joining from, please?
I'm Karina O'Reilly. I'm joining from Ballinasloe.
Welcome, Karina.
Managed to get in last week.
Well, it's great that you're here now, and thanks for coming early as well, just to be sure the technology was cooperating. Karina, do you know much about, have you read her work before, or are you curious?
No, that was the first book I've ever read of hers, actually.
Oh, okay. Brilliant. Oh, you've actually read it. That's wonderful. That's great. Well done. Well done. Anybody else new? I see Annemarie there.
Patsy Murphy. I live in Galway.
Hi, Patsy.
And hi, how are you? I've read her detective stories, and I've read The Head of the Family. So I was very sorry to have missed last week's, because I think you did her crime novels, did you?
No, we're actually using The Bitter Glass. We're spreading it over the floor.
I didn't know which one you were doing, obviously, but those are the ones I've read. I think I read the children's ones a long time ago, and actually happened to have The Bitter Glass in front of me, which I found, so I'll read it over the week.
Oh, wonderful. That's great. I'm delighted you got a copy. The first 3 chapters are available to read free online, and it's also now reissued on Kindle. So even if you don't have a Kindle, you can get the Kindle app and read it on your phone if you have a smartphone. So it's lovely to see it brought out again during her centenary year. Is there anybody else there who wasn't with us last week? No? Okay. Well, welcome back. And I suppose Ireland's modernisation to a progressive first world nation has been extremely rapid, I think we'd all agree. And I think now that there's perhaps a sense of a renewed interest in a vanishing Ireland. And we see this in the popularity of groups, Facebook groups such as Vanishing Ireland. I know a lot of people are sharing lovely black and white photographs of bygone eras with each other. Some of them just ordinary scenes from life a few decades ago, and some of them rare, obscure photos that wouldn't have been circulated among the public before. So there's a keen interest, I think, in this Ireland, and in perhaps slowing down and appreciating and taking stock of our history. And Eilís Dillon's books evoke much of this society in flux, while also offering glimpses of a strong cultural heritage and a rich oral tradition. And this week we're going to talk in a bit more depth about the history and culture in the Bitter Glass, and we'll be discussing her historical novels in general. So I'd like to start by reading a small bit from her own memoir, Inside Ireland. This is a second-hand copy I managed to get. It was first published in 1982. And indeed, the photographs in our opening sequence are taken from this book. And they were taken by photographer Tom Kennedy. And I think it's a lovely companion if you're to reading Eilís Dillon's novels, just to read her life story in this book. So she says, so I want to unpack the quotation that we're using in our intro. She says, I was born in Galway in 1920 into a world of ghosts. So what exactly is she telling us? What is this world of ghosts? So I think this, if I read a little bit from this, it will help to answer that question. I'm going to share the screen with you so you can read along with me. So I was born in Galway in 1920 into a world of ghosts. I was the third child of the family. My senses sharpened at a very early age to understand the things that happened to us. We lived in a state of permanent terror. Violence was all around us. The Black and Tans, the auxiliary police, brought over to quell Ireland for good and all, were riding high, promised full support for their unspeakable actions, out of control even by their own officers. The army was somewhat better, but my earliest memory dates from about my first birthday, March 1921, when a party of soldiers broke into the house, upset the furniture, threw the books down from the shelves, lifted the floorboards in their search for hidden guns, and finished by taking my mother away with them on their lorry, surrounded by fixed bayonets. It was their custom to drive through the town displaying their victim, who was put to stand where he or she could be clearly seen, so as to terrify the townspeople. It was largely successful. My father was on the run, a familiar expression to me as a child, meaning that he had left home and gone into hiding in fear of being murdered. So you can see there the kind of, her senses were sharpened through these experiences from at such a young age. And if we just move down to the bottom of the page, she says, we had moved to that house because it was in a curved terrace and could not be surrounded. The curve meant that it was not easy to identify which garden belonged to our house, and many such moves had been made since the family had come to Galway, where my father had been elected Professor of Chemistry at the university, the old Queen's College. And she says, my mother remained for 3 months in Galway jail, loudly demanding to have me with her. And some kind soul finally asked a question about me in the House of Commons, and she was released. And she continues then finally to say, fear remained long after the war finished and we went to live in the country, but now it was confined to the night time. So these are some of the ghosts. Some of them are from her distant past, her ancestral ghosts, going back to perhaps Oliver Plunkett, going back to her uncle Joseph Mary Plunkett, who was killed in the 1916 Rising. And now we have the spectres of, the war that's going on at the time, with the Black and Tans and the Civil War and the more recent ghosts. So I think that might give you an interesting insight and a kind of a context for where she's coming from. And it also kind of shows us where fact and fiction meet in her book, and truth and reality are blurring. So I think that's a nice continuity from what we were talking about last week with Cormac and Elaine, just to get that insight into her own personal life. And this brings us nicely to the subject of her historical fiction. She published 6 historical novels, and The Bitter Glass was the first of those 6, and it was published in 1958. And I'm just going to try and share another, all her dust jackets now with you. just to show you the covers of the 6 historical novels. So can everybody see that? So the most celebrated of these, I suppose, was Across the Bitter Sea, which was published in 1973 and achieved bestseller status. The Bitter Glass deals with the period of the Irish Civil War, 1922. Blood Relations then followed that. Then came Across the Bitter Sea in 1973. Then Blood Relations was an account of the after effects of the 1916 Rising. Across the Bitter Sea covers a big span of history from 1851 to 1916. Wild Geese, then, she starts looking at the Irish nobility's flight to France after 1691 and Patrick Sarsfield's defeat. A very interesting topic to look at, which has been somewhat neglected, I suppose. Citizen Burke then followed in 1984. This was a chronicle of a conflicted renegade Irish priest, Father James Burke, in post-revolutionary France and Ireland of 1798. And then she comes full circle, and her final historical novel, which was published in 1987, discusses the Irish Civil War in a more focused way. Within the opening chapter of The Bitter Glass, just 3 pages in, she sets the scene. And I'm just going to quickly read that scene. She says, oh, excuse me, if you could just bear with me for a second. There's somebody waiting to get in, and good evening, everyone. Fáilte Stock. Can you switch on your cameras there, please, so I can see those of you who have just joined us? It's great. I'm just going to check and see if there's anybody else waiting to be admitted, because I understood that the link would work automatically, but I see that people are... I'm just going to admit people individually here now. So just keep the mics muted for another little while, but I'd love to see your faces so we can get a sense of a community. We're just talking about Eilís Dillon's 6 historical novels, and we're talking about the 3 pages in where she sets the scene, and she tells us the year was 1922. When this party had left it, Dublin was divided into 2 bitter armies, one battering the other in the ruins of the 4 courts. Now, here's another. Both armies tired and hysterical after the long struggle which had begun in 1916. Each side was willing to die for a principle. On neither side did the leaders care a fig for their lives. All of them had come to terms with death 6 years before. One side was disillusioned and bitter, but willing to build up a new state on the ruins of the old one. On the other side were the diehards who preferred death to dishonour and who were utterly incapable of taking an oath of allegiance to an English king. So throughout Ireland, the Civil War blazed up, Republicans on one side, Free Staters on the other, and poor Mother Éire wringing her hands between the two of them. So very early on, she's setting the scene. She gives us quite a bit of exposition there, quite a bit of historical narrative in the third person. And it's interesting how that third person viewpoint runs throughout the novel, and she uses that to good effect to let us see the inner thoughts of the characters. And so moving this week beyond those first 3 chapters that we looked at last week to come on to chapters 4, 5, 6 and beyond, we find that the Macaulay family are isolated in the big house in Derrylee, with the bridge from Galway to Clifton blown up. And of course, the theme of confinement is very apt for the times we live in now, that sense of, I suppose, of isolation that many of us are feeling now as we are in level 3, and we've got the household ban, the household visits now as well. So it's kind of an apt theme for our times as well. And of course, by chapter 4, they're checking the supplies of flour. And by chapter 5, they're going off to procure some eggs, and they're trying to plan ways of getting enough potatoes in and getting enough food while they're confined there. So Then they meet the local characters and they learn about the flying column that's on the loose. And then by chapter 6, Ruth's younger brother Brian has admitted them into the courtyard and they have a wounded man who requires attention. And we're also learning now that the twin babies with the little baby boy urgently need to see a doctor. So she's creating this tension and she's building it up effectively in short, concise chapters full of atmosphere and tension. So I have a few questions this week about your reading experience of the book, and I'm going to share those questions with you now. And I'd like to break us into smaller groups because we have quite a large group this evening. So I'm going to ask you in the smaller groups to unmute your mics, please. And when you see a little sign saying join the room, please click join. And we'll chat among ourselves for about 10 to between 10 and 15 minutes and discuss those chapters. And then we'll come back and I'll give you 2 minutes notice before I bring you back, and then you'll get a 60 seconds notice as well. And then we'll all come back into the main room and we'll discuss some of our responses to the text then together. So I'm just going to share the questions now. Share screen, and I have, let's see, desktop. I must open it first, isn't that right? Okay, so the questions for this week, can you see those questions yet? Share screen.
No.
No, okay. How about now? Can you see the questions there? Okay. So,
Yes.
Okay, so 3 simple questions that to think about this week. What historical elements in the book struck you as especially interesting or gripping? Is there a passage that really caught your attention? Secondly, how convincing do you think the historical scenes are? Do they ring true? And thirdly, there are many references to traditional Irish ballads and the folk culture of Connemara in the novel. What aspects of the cultural or oral tradition appeal to you in this book? So I will give you just a little bit of a minute there just to take down those questions if you'd like to do so. And then when I stop sharing them, you'll automatically be assigned into smaller rooms. And we'll have a good 10 minutes or to 12 minutes to chat. And then I'll bring you back. Welcome back, everyone.
Hi.
It sounded like you were having some really interesting discussions and very engaging, getting deep into the history and some of the folklore and the writing itself, how she's creating, how she's doing, achieving what she's achieving with the style of writing and the third-person narrative. And would anybody like to feed back? In room 1, we had Annemarie, Karina, Cecily, Patsy, and Sorika. Would anybody from that group just like to share a little bit about what you were talking about in the smaller group? Anybody from room 1?
Well, I was only listening because I hadn't read the book, but the conversation was very interesting. And Ceci, who lives in West Cork, was very illuminating, talking about the violence and about things that she remember being told by her mother. I thought she should be writing her memoirs, I feel. Ceci,
there you go, Cecily.
It was absolutely fascinating, and the discussion was very interesting. But as I say, I didn't contribute because I hadn't read it. I was just listening, but it was very enjoyable.
Yeah. And you're very welcome to participate as a listener as well. You don't have to have all the homework done. Maybe by week 4 it would be nice, but
I will have next week, but I don't know.
So I'm looking forward to talking to Annemarie very shortly now. So I'm just going to ask maybe room 2 and room 3. In room 2 we had Aoife, Bridget, Kay, Kevin and Siobhan. is there anything you'd like to feed back there that engaged you in room 2?
I think our conversation was about very much focused on how she drew out the conflicts in the ethics. Would I be correct in saying that, folks? That, you know, between the example somebody gave there, sorry, no, not I can't see every face because of the size of my screen, but that contrast between the prayers for the baby and then, you know, that fairly dogged approach that, you know, people who need to be punished or killed, that would happen, and how that, you know, sat in the same space, you know, and how that was kind of a theme, and people talked around aspects of that theme, really, I think.
Very interesting.
Is that a fair comment, do you think?
And she integrates all of that, doesn't she? Especially, I suppose, the conversation between Captain Horgan and Joe is where she really gives us a kind of a glimpse into both sides of the thinking. And that's in chapter 16, I think. Chapter 15, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, so that's... I actually have a photograph here that I found of the West Connemara flying column in 1921. I'm just going to share it there now because I think it's very interesting to see. Can you see that there?
I can.
Yes, and P.T. MacDonald was the commanding officer there in the West Connemara flying column. I'll just show you P.T. MacDonald now in his IRA uniform. So I'm going to stop that share and I'll share this one now. So there's P.J. MacDonald, and I wonder, is Captain Horgan modelled on this character? You know, I don't have any definitive answers on that, but you can read, you know, the military, the Bureau of Military History. You can read accounts of his own personal testimonies up online and everything. And in fact, there was a wonderful illuminating article in the Galway Advertiser by Ronnie O'Gorman, which I'm just going to share with you now, and it is called. It's called Connemara Becomes Battlefield in Tan War, and it was published in 2013. And if you put in that title in Galway Advertiser, it's very interesting to read it. And he's drawing upon Ernie O'Malley's collections of the testimonials from people who fought in the Civil War and the War of Independence. And many of these people, the books are called The Men Will Talk to Me, Confessions from whether it's Galway or whatever county. And
we lost you there. I've lost your sound.
Oh, is my sound gone?
No, it's back. I don't know. I missed what you said.
Okay. Just that he's drawing upon Ernie O'Malley's books, and Ernie O'Malley collected testimonials from people who fought in the war and would only really tell him, you know, give their accounts to him. They wouldn't tell their families in many cases. So it's a fascinating part of our history, and it's been difficult to address it, you know, but I think we're a mature society now, and we're getting a little bit more, I suppose, prepared to have these conversations, which is always helpful.
My next door neighbour actually was present at that incident that you have there at the railway station on September the 8th, whenever it was. And it was interesting to reflect on it later, because he had one perspective as an eyewitness, and he hadn't actually realised that somebody had been shot dead. In a way, we would discuss that in our own house, how because he, you know, was there when the whole thing went down and had to leg it out of the place like everybody else did, he didn't have the entire story, if you know what I mean. So that's interesting.
My goodness. Bridget, you'll have to write your memoirs now, or your
where
share
I'm
your
from,
own.
they're very good at keeping their mouth shut till the bitter end. Not like, seriously, you know, the man who lived to be 102 kept his mouth shut to the whole bit.
Wow.
Not a word out of him. No.
Now, coming on to room 3, is there anybody there who'd like to feed back some of what you discussed in the room 3? We had Anne-Marie, Connie, Eileen Murphy and Patrick. Just very briefly, because I want to introduce Anne-Marie now shortly. Okay, well, it was lovely to be a fly on the wall, floating among all the groups and to hear the conversations, the lively discussions you were having. And long may they continue. Next week, of course, we're going to be talking to Siobhan Morrissey, an expert on Dillon as well, and looking at her children's literature. And Siobhan is going to be talking about The Seals, which is available to read on Kindle, and which is a nice complement to The Bitter Glass because it's set in the same era with the Black and Tans, etc. And she's also going to talk about The Lost Island. And these are the books of her children's books that were published by the New York Review of Books, again reissued more recently. I think that Siobhan is going to talk about The Lost Island as well next week, so really looking forward to that. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our special guest for this evening. Dr. Annemarie Herron is a former primary school principal with an abiding interest in literature and in publications for children in particular. She has studied extensively in this area and in 2011 completed a PhD thesis entitled The Tyranny of the Past, Revolution, Retrospection and Remembrance in the work of Irish writer Eilís Dillon. Since then, she has worked as an independent researcher with a focus on the arts and education within various institutions and cultural bodies. You're very welcome, Annemarie. Wonderful to have you here this evening. Can you unmute your mic there, Annemarie, please? No.
There.
Oh,
Sorry.
we have you now. We have you now. No problem at all. And just to mention that you have different options in the view if you want to see everybody. If you click on the top right, you see those little boxes in the top right. You can get gallery view, or you can get speaker view. So if you do the speaker view, you can see everybody's face. Just to mention those different options that exist in Zoom. So, Annemarie, delighted to have you with us. Your thesis is such a fascinating, beautiful, comprehensive and very well written piece of work. I would love to see it published. I'd love you to. I think it's a fantastic read, and I learned so much from reading it. And I have a few questions I'd like to ask you, I suppose with the historical perspective this evening. Eilís Dillon asserted that she was always especially interested in the impact of great events on the ordinary person. With her foray into historical writing, is there a sense that Dillon felt a responsibility to tell the story of Ireland's struggle for independence as she saw it, and perhaps to counter or to prevent cultural amnesia?
Yes, I did. I do think that she had a big responsibility. I think it was almost in her DNA to have that, because she grew up listening to anecdotes about her famous and glorious relatives, the Dillons and the Plunketts, who had participated in Irish life for generations, right back to the Normans. So she was surrounded by stories of people who had given to their country and who were patriotic in some way or another. So I think she wanted to contribute to that herself, and I think her way of doing it was through her writing, and she felt it was incumbent on her because she had all these stories and she knew the background so well. I suppose to educate us a little bit about, how ordinary people were impacted by all of these events in history, and I think she just wanted to bring it to everybody's attention what had gone on, and I suppose people were beginning to forget, or maybe, as you say, to kind of suppress their memories of the bad parts of our history. And as one of, I think it was Bridget said, that silence prevailed largely, particularly about anything that was contentious. So I think she wanted to open that silence, and I think as well she wanted to do that with a view to reconciliation, and hope that if we could look at our past, confront it, and maybe move on and, be reconciled and forgive each other for everything that went on. I think that was her mission, really.
Yes, I think that's a really important note there, because the note of conciliation comes through in the work very strongly. The romantic nationalism is definitely there, but there's also a focus on conciliation, isn't there? And that's so important. And maybe she got that from her parents, that sense of social conscience as well. Do you think she was brave in writing The Bitter Glass in 1958?
I think she was very brave, actually, again, because of that amnesia that was there and the silence. So, yeah, 1958 wasn't that long after the Civil War had happened, and a lot of the people who had been involved in it were still very much active in Irish life. So it had been suppressed as well, and people didn't really talk about it. So she was brave, but I think she was also a little naive. She didn't realise that there might be such negativity around it when it was published. And while she was very much praised in international publications for her writing and for the story she told, it wasn't quite the same in Ireland. She got very mixed reviews, and in some cases nasty enough. And I think that really affected her, and it made her avoid historical fiction until 1973, when she came out of the Across the Bitter Sea. So I think possibly she was naive and very, very affected by that criticism that had happened. So it was almost like she shouldn't have brought the topic forward at all. So I think that really was a feature.
That's remarkable, because there is a notable gap there, 1958 until 1973 for the Across the Bitter Sea. And it's kind of sad, because it's such a beautiful book, and I suppose being an adopted Galwegian, it's just lovely to see my city and county represented so beautifully. And it's sad that it's kind of lain, for a while.
She's an emerging writer and very susceptible to the criticism that came her way. She wasn't as hugely confident at that stage. And she'd written her children's books and she'd written detective novels, but what she really wanted to write was this story of Ireland, and so I think it affected her deeply.
And a hallmark of her historical writing, I suppose, is her commitment to accuracy. And you note that in the thesis as well. Can you tell us about the depth of research that she undertook before writing some of these novels?
Gosh, she planned everything in huge detail beforehand. Even for The Bitter Glass, she had written down scenes, as she called them, very cinematically, of what would be in the book when she eventually wrote it. And then when she planned for Across the Bitter Sea, my goodness, she had what she called set pieces, little vignettes that she planned to have in the book. And I think she was going to put them in no matter what, and that's why the book became so long, because she had such a wealth of things to say that they all had to get in there somewhere. Her mother was a great source for her for accuracy, and also details like what a person of stature would have read, and what the women would have worn, how they would have acted, all the manners of the period. So yeah, and I suppose the great illustration of it is in the book we're reading. The scene in the Galway market is stunning for its accuracy. Well, that's what I imagine was its accuracy. Just
it is, yeah.
The detail. I can just imagine her being there and seeing all these things, and she brings out the colours and the sounds and all of that.
Oh, she really does. It's beautiful writing and such descriptive detail. Do you think The Bitter Glass is representative of her other historical novels? Is it a good introduction? Is it a good place to start?
Definitely is. She brings in all the things. I think even starting with the word bitter, which comes up in the two books, it's about this bitterness that if we look back, we need to look at the bitterness and get over it basically, and try and move on from it. That's one of her central themes, really. But then there's the whole thing about, of course, the west of Ireland, and in particular we were talking about the islands, which feature in her children's books, and the island comes into actually all her books practically. Her detective novels, where people are removed from the scene, they're cut off somehow in a nursing home or a college, and in The Bitter Glass, they're cut off, as we said earlier, not by the sea, but they're cut off by that railway being gone. And so they're out of society in a way, and then they have to survive in a way. So she's used that island theme all along. Then, of course, the Irish language comes in, very much so, and she sprinkles it throughout, and I think that's a lovely part of it, actually. Trying to think what else themes. The Anglo-Irish ascendancy, the houses in decline, the great houses in decline. I'm trying to think what else. The roles of women and their place in society. So yeah, it's a great introduction for anything else that she wrote, because it's all in there in microcosm in The Bitter Glass.
And indeed, the fact that she gives such agency to women and that she focuses on their private lives is almost kind of a counter to male historiography too, in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah, and she tends to put in the wise old woman, in the west of Ireland, who is noble and gentle and wise and strong and all the things that women should be, and sometimes in contrast to the weaker feminine side of the nobility.
Yes. Now I suppose there's a challenge there for historical writers who want to, tell a great story, but also kind of engage in serious historiography. It can be a bit of a dichotomy. Do you think that Eilís Dillon handles that well? Because she is aiming to to kind of educate in a way without being didactic, and she's aiming to bring in the history, but she's trying to tell the story as well, and it's often a fine balance.
I think she knew so much about history that she really had the facts at her fingertips, and it had been all around her growing up, and of course with her close relations who had put themselves up there fighting. So I think history was kind of bred into her, and she had to, I didn't think she wanted to write a history book per se. She wanted to write stories, and the story is built around the history, if you like. It was interesting, she didn't use real historical figures, or they didn't feature much, maybe in passing. She mentioned Collins a few times, he was a friend of the family. But she didn't actually let us hear their voices at all. I think she felt that would do them a disservice. So she just used fictional characters, and it was really then about how the history was in the background, but it impacted on their lives in very different ways. So she brought it alive, I suppose, for the normal reader who didn't necessarily want to delve into a heavy history tone.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That was a very interesting choice that she made, not to bring in, not to give their actual names. And I remember reading in your thesis there was one character that she did give. Now, of course, in the Bitter Glass, she does talk about the Countess Markovich, but it's relayed by a third person, talking about Countess Markovich. I thought that was really remarkable, that piece.
And in terms of her accuracy, again, about historical people, she or her family maintained that Michael Collins had been in at the first Dáil, the meeting at the first Dáil, but or her mother said that she had seen him. Yeah. Now, she couldn't corroborate that, so she didn't include it in the book. But she was very meticulous about what was real and what couldn't be, where there was no evidence.
And of course, you can see her papers, her actual papers in the National Library. Isn't that correct? I haven't, with the COVID restrictions and things, I had hoped to get up there and to see.
You need a fortnight's holidays. Quite a lot of papers there.
Yeah, I'd love to get a chance to wade through. In fact, I'm just going to share her typewriter with you now, because it's in the lexicon in Dún Laoghaire, and Cormac kindly sent this photo. Just so you can see the Olivetti typewriter that he was talking about last week. So she wrote across the Bitter Sea directly onto that typewriter there, and you can see it on display in Dún Laoghaire in the lexicon.
That was probably state of the art at the time.
Yes. Actually, he did send me a note about it, and he said she bought it in Rome in the 1960s. And for the first time began to compose her writings directly onto the keyboard. So it's lovely to see that. Just, I suppose, drawing to a close now, we've got a few minutes left. What do you think the relevance of her books is today for us? And is a reassessment of Eilís Dillon timely?
I think her books are relevant in a way about reminding us, particularly at this time of commemoration. I mean, of the beginning of the 20th century, and at that time it was very troubled. So I think, it's worth looking back at her books to get the perspective that she had in writing. And I suppose it's sort of lest we forget, we should remember, what did go on, be truthful about it, and I think that's her message, and it's still relevant today. And what was your last part of the question? Sorry.
Absolutely. In this decade of commemorations and centenaries, I suppose we're in the second phase now, and we're probably in the slightly more difficult phase to talk about. So I think anything like this that can help us to have those conversations is really valuable. Yeah. And I suppose just the relevance of the books today, and reassessing her work. She's certainly carved out, as Siobhan will be telling us, her stature in the pantheon of writers for children is kind of unquestioned. But it would be interesting to reevaluate her place as a historical writer, maybe, and to look at the rest of her work as well.
I think maybe some of her books now would be regarded as classics, and we should look at them in that way, that they're of a time. They're not necessarily going to appeal to everybody nowadays in how we think in a modern way, and particularly children have moved on too. But they are a record of a time that was, and a place, the West of Ireland as it was then.
Absolutely, so true. Yes, yeah.
And just a final question, I suppose. How do you think Eilís Dillon would like to be remembered?
I think she was so keen to be a good writer. I think she'd be happy to be remembered as a writer. I think she'd be really happy to be read 100 years after her birth, and I think she'd be really happy to have that celebrated in Galway. which is so close to her heart. So I think this has been a great tribute to her, and thank you all for joining me.
Thanks so much, Annemarie. That was really wonderful and very enlightening. Thanks, honoured to have you with us this evening. And on that note, folks, I'm going to say Ihiwa and Gurmina Mahagi, Asfa Lynn Anshaw, Cora agus Ikanj fi the bitter glass agus fi sale agus Ober Eilís Dillon. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week. And Siobhan, we're especially excited to have you back with us next week talking about her children's writing. And if you can get a copy of the Seals to download it to Kindle and have a little look at it before next week, that'd be great if you feel inclined. And it certainly does complement the bitter glass because of the theme, the historical theme.
Sorry, about the seals.
The seals, and seals like the animal seals, SEALS.
Like the animal, okay.
Yeah.
Great.
And I think Siobhan will be talking about the Lost Island as well. And if you have any little people or you know, people in your family, children in your family who might like to read her adventure stories, you can get these ones quite readily. Some of the others are harder to get, but these ones have been reissued by the New York Review of Books. So I will say good night to you all, and thanks very much for your contributions, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Slán.
Thank you.